So if this is going over people's heads, and it's going over mine a little bit already, what have you discovered? What might be interesting for people here?
Well, what I have discovered is, in a certain sense, I have discovered a new way to do philosophy. That we should start to philosophize, to think the deep fundamental questions of life within atmosphere of experiential breathing. And it's like, in my view, it's like a possibility of attaining a certain kind of a respiratory revolution in our lives, so that everything that we have thought in different manners in philosophy and in sciences and in religion and so on, in our culture and different cultures, is that everything, actually, all our questions, important questions of our life, could be re-examined, rethought, and re-experienced within the experience of breathing. And of course, in some of the Eastern traditions, as you mentioned, the breath has been important, but I would say that even they have not thought like questions of, or maybe they have, but because all the vocabulary needs to be translated into our Western languages, and also there is so much like layers in the Eastern thought of, like, let's say the word Atman, which is so important word in Hindu philosophy and in Upanishads and in other Indian philosophical systems. And it is even for the Indian tradition, it has been forgotten quite much, that if we think of what Atman means, they say it's the inner soul, or the fundamental principle of life, or the immortal soul, or the great spirit, or whatever. But it is very often forgotten that Atman actually means, in the first place, breathing.
Okay, so I mean, can you give an example of this philosophy of breath, this philosophical breathing philosophy combinations? Give me an example about what that looks like.
Well, the first of all, I would say that what it looks like is that whatever question we are thinking, whatever philosophical question, we need to bring it back to our experience of breath. So, for example, if we start to think ethical questions, the questions of, like, what is a good life, then this we bring it to the question, if the breath is the certain kind of root or the source of our being and our way of being in the world and our relation to the atmosphere of air. So what would that mean if we start to think the questions of good life? So that would mean that we would, in the first place, would start to need to think, what does it mean that as a breathing beings who are all the time connected with this atmosphere, this invisible atmosphere through our breath, how we would connect the ethical questions, for example, the question of good life, into this kind of, how would I say, into this kind of field of respiratory thinking. So then it means this, that whatever we are thinking, we need to bring it back to questions of breath and start to think, what would it mean if we take seriously that we are, in the first place, breathing beings?
So this is your philosophical breath work.
Yes.
I'm fascinated by embodied ethics as an idea. I studied ethics a little bit at university as a sideline, just as I was doing psychology, but of all the sort of philosophical, the areas of philosophy, ethics, and, you know, what is the good life? What do we value? Or what should I fucking do when I get up in the morning? You know, like that always struck me as the most practical form of philosophy in many ways. It's like, okay, well, what's good? You know, what has value? And it's very interesting. I was doing a lot of martial arts at the time, and it was it felt like I was doing this physical thing, and then, you know, seriously connect with ethics, and noticing in my body that I'd have ethical responses to things. You know, some things would take my breath away, some things would, you know, tighten my breath, some things would smoothen my breath when I did good things in a certain way. And yet that was just never talked about in any of the philosophy books I was reading. There was just zero on the body, yet it was ethics was very obviously a bodily experience for me. Some things opened my heart, some things made me contract, you know. And I saw almost nothing in the philosophy books that I read about the body.
Well, for example, when I said the ethics, and you said that it's the question of the body and connected with breathing, the ethical questions. One of the things that I have written about, and I gave also a presentation in Slovenia a few years ago, there was a hospitality conference, the hospitality of ethical hospitality, or hospitality of ethics. I gave a talk where, and then it later was published in one book about anthology on hospitality. And my article and my presentation was about the respiratory and aerial hospitality. So first, we have this idea that we welcome somebody with open arms into our house, and then this is as a form of hospitality. So the respiratory hospitality would mean that actually, if we would become conscious of it or aware, we are all the time welcoming with open lungs this invisible atmosphere of air, even if we wouldn't want to do it, but then we could do kind of a practice of it and make it consciously, that when that invisible air that I don't know for certain what it is about, but I have to take it in me, it might have
profound trust in a way, isn't it? There's an act to breathe is an act of profound trust, and also it strikes me as profoundly intimate that normally, you know, to take something into your body, if you were to do that with a penis or, you know, some other bodily part, that's a tremendously intimate thing if someone put their tongue in your mouth or whatever. But we're literally taking something into us, this very intimate thing. And the other thing that always strikes me as very interesting is sort of self and other with breath. That it's like we have this as, well, I'm here and the world's there, but I have to keep taking in this thing from outside of the world into myself, you know, and then it becomes me. And equally, I'm continuously giving out. So there's a sense of trust in and kind of generosity out. You know, there's a way in which it also connects us to every single person, right? Like we're all breathing the same air. Like me and you, we're in different countries right now. But if I breathe out, that air is going into the same air that you're breathing. Does that make sense? Exactly. So there's this way, this is connecting quality to air, which I think doesn't exist. Like I can't touch you from another country, but I'm literally breathing into the air that you're breathing into and out of on a moment by moment basis.
Yeah, this is extremely important point that you're making here, and this is the how in a certain kind of mysterious connection we are all the time with other people. That air that was inside of you is now inside of somebody else, and there's a dog that is perhaps breathing that, and then you take that person's, and then there might be some smelling drunkard whose breath you are taking next in, and then there is the person that you hate might be in the same place, or somebody else that is just looking some that you would never want to talk or even touch. That person who has, for example, politically disgusting ideas from your point of view, or whatever that might be, still you are in a much more intimate connection with these people and these all other breathing beings. So it is a question of trust, and there comes a certain kind of way of which then comes to connection to this idea of hospitality, that could we learn totally different kind of way of opening ourselves to others who might think very differently than us, or might have nothing in common with us. So that also is one aspect of that ethical dimension of breathing. Then you mentioned trust, and trust is connected with also, you could think of in a certain way religious questions. So that would, if we would take that idea of respiratory trust, there I would suggest, when I said that all things could be rethought from the perspective of breathing, then we could start to think totally new way of thinking religion from as a kind of a respiratory religion.
Yeah, well, there's always been this connection of spirituality, like spirit as breath, breath as spirit, hasn't there?
Yes.
And I'll come back to religion. That feels like a thing to move towards. What about in a sort of COVID, post-COVID environment that, you know, people are being asked to cover their mouths, to not breathe on each other. I had a very interesting thing yesterday where I tried to talk to a stranger and they almost jumped back you know,
Mhm.
and like, and I was 2 or 3 meters away. I was quite far away, but they really jumped back. And
Mhm.
it was like, don't breathe on me. That's
Mhm.
deadly, you know, like this idea of the breath has become a weapon now. You know, you can, I heard in England, you can, if you think you have COVID and you cough on someone, you can be accused of attempted murder.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. So so if you think you have a COVID diagnosis and you're deliberately coughing on people, that is attempted murder. Very interesting. Now, I don't know if
Yes,
that's
it
legally
is.
going to stand up, but I made a joke about this. I said, oh, I'm just going to go around licking everyone. They're like, okay, you could actually be put in prison for that. So it's, what about this idea that breath has become dangerous in the modern age?
Yes, well, of course, this has been, in a certain way, atmosphere has been, you can think atmosphere, like this kind of atmospheric terrorism or atmo-terrorism, where you use already, it's not only in the first place the breath, but how whatever takes place in this invisible atmosphere of air where we don't see what kind of particles are moving there. As I was coming into that when there is this, that you need to breathe the air and you are kind of like your life depends on it, and then you don't know what this kind of unfamiliar breath is that same time is keeping you alive. And this was of course used, for example, when they were using poison gases in the First World War, as this kind of atmospheric terrorism, or German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk has written about this. He calls it atmo-terrorism. And how to then...
Sloterdijk is his name. What a great name for someone studying death in the trenches. Sloterdijk. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So, and then how also in the Second World War, in the concentration camps, the gassing of the Jews was taking place. That was also taking place through the breath. So there is a long history, kind of, or there is a history of this kind of breath as a weapon, or the atmosphere as a weapon.
We tend to think of breath in terms of the best things, like it took my breath away. That woman was so beautiful, it took my breath away. But equally, the idea of strangling someone, gassing someone, I mean, these are some of the most repulsive things as well. So it seems to exist on us, if we talk aesthetics now rather than ethics as well, it seems to exist on an aesthetic spectrum, from the most horrific, ugly things human beings can do, you know, on the moral end as well as the aesthetic end, but also we talk about it in regard to the most beautiful things, you know, like you wouldn't share breath with someone deliberately unless you really liked them, you know, like breathe in and out of each other's eyes, like CPR, bit gross, you know, old person falls down in the street of a heart attack. Do you really want to do mouth to mouth? I mean, you will, I hope, out of duty, but you're not going to enjoy it, right? So it's like this, it has this kind of a very aesthetic range, you know what I mean, from the very ugly to the very beautiful.
Yes, and that brings to my mind what some of the early Christians were doing when you said the breath is spirit and spirit is breath. This idea, they had this kind of practice, or this kind of like connection that they called conspiratio. So originally the word conspiration means, like, in a certain way could say respiration is always conspiration, because conspiration or conspiracy doesn't mean what we nowadays talk about, conspiracy theories and stuff like this, but it meant breathing together, because that
the Maori greeting where you take a breath together, that's
yes, so
noses, yeah.
Exactly. So there was there is an interpretation, or there is a theory, that the early Christians, when, for example, in the Gospel of John, it is said that Jesus breathed the Holy Spirit to the disciples, that there was actually this practice that connected in the most deep sense all the followers of Jesus together, was that they were blowing breath into each other's mouth, as the practice of sharing the Spirit, because the Holy Spirit, the Greek word is pneuma, which means at the same time spirit and breath.
Yes, and a few other languages too. You'll see that connection in Hebrew, I think it might be as well. And That's very interesting. So there's almost a lineage transmission, isn't there? It's like you're being breathed on by someone who was breathed on by Jesus or something, you know?
Exactly.
This kind of piece, there's a transmission piece there, yeah. So,
but then when the Black Death came, then people
that went out of fashion.
The greatest idea.
That went out of fashion. Those guys died off pretty quick. So actually,
Yeah,
I mean, breaking aside,
and we forget that. The Christianity forget that, the whole thing.
We can't go rid of that one. I worry about a world where we're scared of breath. It disturbs me. There's something about this young woman who stepped back yesterday away from me, where I thought, I worry that that's becoming a norm now. That it's, you know, in the same way as like, I wouldn't call what happened in the trenches terrorism. I just call that war, you know, breath war. But I mean, now it's almost like, okay, is this without going to conspiracy theory kind of, you know, conspiracy, we'll bring that in again. But it seems to me there's this making us afraid of each other's breath is a very primary thing, whether it's justified or not. That's a very primary thing to install in a global populace, a global population. I was on a plane recently, and for the first time in ages, and people were like scared to breathe because they didn't want to breathe, but you can't not breathe, right? It's like you could not touch, you could not eat for a little bit, you could not drink the water for a few days, but you can't not breathe.
Yeah, I mean, if this goes on, this kind of afraidness of and the fear of breath because of COVID or something else, it's gonna totally transform our way of being. And I really hope that it's not going toward that kind of direction.
Yeah. There's a dehumanizing quality, a disconnecting quality as well in that.